This is the sixth and final lecture of the life and radical thought of Baruch Spinoza. And today what I would like to do is to look at, finish up work on the Theological-Political treatise and look at his political elements. We're especially going to look at the last chapters. As I mentioned last time, having sort of done his biblical analysis and his analysis of religion and his rejection of supernaturalism, that's the foundation for his political thought of universal religion and political free thinking and thought. And what he then goes on to do is to describe, and of course one of his main aims was to separate philosophy from theology. As I've said, if Philo began the marriage of philosophy and Scripture, Spinoza broke it apart. And what he wants to do now is, and this is specifically for, if I could have the originals back up here, specifically for his time, is to talk about the political implications of his thought. Because what he's trying to do is to create a situation where you have a state in which there is what we would call a fair separation of religion and state. Not the way it ended up in the American Constitution per se, because he does still say that the state has the right to regulate behavior, but he wants to advocate a great deal of tolerance, and freedom of thought. Before we get into this, though, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, if you look at the material I sent out to you, I wanted to give you three things that have come up in the discussion so that people understand, again, what it is. First of all, Spinoza is a pantheist in his conception of God. And I think some of you are not really sure of what that term means. Pantheism, as opposed to what is called classical theism. Theism is the idea that God is a being who creates the universe, but is not the universe, is somehow separated from the universe. That doesn't mean that God's presence cannot come into the universe, or God cannot communicate with the universe or act on the universe, but there is an essential difference between God and God's creation. Pantheism is something completely different, as Monty Python would say. If you take a look on the first page of what I've given you, George, do you want to read the definition of pantheism?
Pantheism is the belief that the universe, or nature is the totality of everything, is identical with divinity, or that everything composes an all-encompassing, immanent God. Pantheists thus do not believe in a distinct personal or anthropomorphic God. Therefore, God is being, not a being. So, does everybody get that?
In other words, the universe and God are co-equal. They are not separate. The universe or nature is God. And as such, it's not a personal God. God is not a being, but being itself, the ground of existence. And there are variations on pantheism, but essentially, for most of the history of Western religion, just a minute, Harvey, this is, of course, quite antithetical to the classic Abrahamic tradition's ideas about the relationship between God and nature, but that is not to say that in certain areas of mysticism there are Jewish pantheists, specifically in certain streams of Hasidic thought, represents essentially a pantheistic view of the world where all is God. Yes, Harvey, you had a question.
You said a dual. How can I put this? God and recap.
Okay. Yes, Stephen.
In elementary school, I I learned that pantheists are people who pray to trees.
No, that's a kind of simplistic idea.
Very primitive kind of.
No, that's animism. Animism is positing that there is spirit, sort of divine spirits in everything. Pantheism is a distinct theological and philosophical stance. It's not necessarily co-equal with paganism. Okay, you can be a pantheist and not a paganist and pagan in any way whatsoever. And the kind of pantheism we're looking at in terms of Spinoza and the deists of the 18th century, who were essentially pantheists, have nothing to do with that. Okay, so the other important idea is the difference, and this is the difference between Spinoza and Descartes, is between dualism and monism, and I found this nice little chart here. So René Descartes introduced what's called Cartesian duality, which has had a huge influence on Western thought. And there is a sharp divide between matter and mind. In other words, the P is physical substance, and M is mental substance, and they are radically different. And this kind of dualism has had a long history. I mean, it does derive from Greek ideas about the dualism between body and soul, but Descartes took it much, much further. And by the way, it's one of the things that has been since the time of Descartes has been argued a lot, and Spinoza was against this kind of radical dualism, and Leibniz following him. They subscribed to a more monistic approach to the relationship between mind and matter. Now, according to this chart, there are three forms of monism. One is physicalism, where matter, in effect, is more substantial than mind, right? Meaning that mind is merely an emergence from matter, okay? Idealism, where mind is more fundamental than matter. I think Henri Bergson was a subscriber of this. And then what's called neutral monism, where mind and matter are not, in effect, separate substances, but reflections or aspects of a unified substance. That's Spinoza's and Leibniz's position. Yes?
How would these schools differentiate brain and mind?
Well, but that's the point. That's the part of the argument that's going on today. Is mind merely brain? Right? That's a kind of physicalism monism. Is mind separate from brain? That's dualism. Or is mind and brain, is mind a kind of an emergent quality of brain which represents something, it's not nothing but a bunch of neurons, but somehow there is something, but it's more of the neutral idea where, and this is an argument that's going on between philosophers and physicists and biologists and theologians, and so this is a very, neurological science especially. This is one of the hottest areas of of what's going on in science, because it's an attempt to try and understand how consciousness works, and there's been some really interesting material written on it from a religious perspective. There's a rabbi I know in Texas who wrote a whole book about a Jewish response to this science. Okay.
Could you repeat the definition of neutral monism?
It's where mind and matter are not separate substances, but are kind of emergent qualities of a single substance. And that's really where Spinoza was. The third thing that I want to do, because a couple of times the question of how did Spinoza, believe in the existence of God, right? And there are several classical arguments for the existence of God. The Aristotelian one is what's called the cosmological argument for the existence of God, which is the first cause. Everything has a cause, and therefore, if you go back through the chain of causes, there's a first cause, and that's God. God is the first cause. By the way, this discussion is still going on. Stephen Hawking has even talked about this. And Maimonides, by the way, employs that at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah. That's essentially his proof for or argument for the existence of God. There is the teleological argument for the existence of God, which, to put it in other terms, is the argument from design, meaning creation appears to be orderly to the extent that it appears to have emerged from a divine plan. That argument has had its ups and downs, especially because of Darwinism, but it was not employed by Maimonides, for example, as a proof or an argument for the existence of God, but rather as a means of producing piety. The classic argument by I forget who it was, by one theologian is, if you find a watch on the shore of the sands, you assume that there was a watchmaker and that the watch did not spontaneously, come together through the movement of the grains of sand. I mean, that argument was taken apart by David Hume, and Richard Dawkins, late, in the modern period, has attacked that. So did Stephen Jay Gould. But there are still some elements of that argument, and of course, the crudest form of it today are the people who claim, that intelligent design people. But it actually has a long history in Judaism. Philo, I think, is the first one to utilize it, where he uses the metaphor of, if you see a statue, a beautiful statue, you assume there's a sculptor. But the third argument, which is only found originated in Christian circles, Jews and Muslims did not employ this, is called the ontological argument for the existence of God, and was first formulated by a Christian theologian by the name of St. Anselm. And this is the classic version of it, and which René Descartes accepted, in which Spinoza basically also accepted. There are variations of this. Even to this day, there are people who argue this in a modern context and in a much more complicated version of this. And I don't want to really get into it, but this is how Spinoza believed that God exists, essentially. Would somebody like to read it? Suzanne?
The ontological argument.
Go ahead, Harvey.
The ontological argument has been formulated by philosophers including St. Anselm and René Descartes. The argument proposes that God's existence is self-evident. The logic, depending on the formulation, reads roughly as follows. God is the greatest conceivable being. It is greater to exist than not to exist. Therefore, God is...
Now, I mean, you might see this as a bit of linguistic legerdemain, which it's one of the critiques of it. Bertrand Russell originally believed in it, but then came to reject it. But this is the basic argument. There's a much more sophisticated versions of it that are a lot more complicated that you can find. So these are just some points that I think are important to understand about Spinoza's thought, about where he lies on various philosophical spectra. So let's get right back to the work. Now, chapter 16 is on page 195, is about how he believes that the state has the right. Well, first of all, he begins to talk about the civil rights of each individual, that every single person has inherent rights, all right? And if you take a look on page 196, he says, Here we recognize no difference between human beings and other individual things of nature, nor between those human beings who are endowed with reason and those who do not know reason. In other words, everything has an inherent equality. Now, from this, however, there are people, everybody is, born with different kinds of backgrounds and produce different kinds of emotional stuff. And so Spinoza believes that the state has the right to regulate behavior in order to promote civic order. That they can't just let everybody do what they want. And once you're a member of that state, you in effect have voluntarily submitted yourself to the power of that state. And therefore the state has power over you.
Isn't that like the social contract that founders?
Yes, it's exactly like that. And I mentioned this when we were looking at if you accept American citizenship, you are accepting the power of American law over you, right? If you don't wish to do that, then you must, renounce your citizenship and go somewhere else. But you're never going to find a place where you are not subject to the laws of the authority that you live with. I mean, anarchists obviously are against this idea entirely, right? And the power of that state to regulate your life is a great deal of argument amongst liberals, conservatives, libertarians. I mean, this is the big argument. I mean, it's the reason why there are differences between European perspectives on the power of government versus Americans, because the Americans revolted against a power that they thought where the government was, oppressive. So the government puts, and when you find that there is a kind of knee-jerk anti-government which is sort of fundamental to the culture of the United States, whereas European ideas, and this I think would mostly include Canada as well, has more idea that accepts a paternalism of the governmental power, has a more positive essential perspective on government power, even though there can be limits. I mean, obviously, in countries like in Germany specifically, there is a great deal of suspicion about certain aspects of government power because of their own particular history. But essentially, it's the reason why people in Europe or in Canada have far fewer problems with things like universal health care, as an example. Okay. And the ability of the government to intervene in society. And this is Spinoza, right? And the republicanism that was quite common in his day. Now, after having discussed this, one of the fascinating things is that he, in chapter 17, he kind of goes back and uses the Moses and the Israelites, the pre-monarchical stage of Israelite history, as a kind of almost ideal kind of state. And he's making a comparison between the tribal confederacy and the way Holland is being run. Because Holland didn't have a single central government, right? It was made up of a series of more or less semi-independent city-states. Now, they all got together and they had a kind of unified overall government, but there was a huge amount of power by each of those individual states to determine the character of those states, including how much they were going to regulate their citizenry. So Spinoza is in effect saying the old Israelite tribal system, where you had this confederacy of tribes, but each one of them, in effect, ruled themselves, as a kind of ideal form of republicanism here. And what he is also arguing, by the way, is that once the Israelite state, and so the laws in the Torah are the laws for this state. And once this state was dissolved, these laws have no effect, are not universal. They were written for a particular nation at a particular time. and they have no subsequent validity for anybody else, which is one of the reasons why he rejected the whole rabbinic tradition of adding to and interpreting, because he says these laws are now irrelevant. And that's why before, when we read what he considered the basic principles of universal religion, anyway, so he does a considerable analysis of the ancient Israelite state. It's quite fascinating. And chapter 18 are some political principles he says he derives from it and its history. But then in chapter 19, he then goes on to talk about what is the authority of the state to govern the religious life of the people in the state. And he actually, and this is where he obviously differs from the American founding fathers, is he believes that the state has the power and the right to regulate religious behavior. Okay? And I think he does this because he wants the state to be able to, in effect, check fanaticism and intolerance.
Wasn't this like a self-protection also for himself?
Well, he was don't forget, he's not alone in this idea. He represents a train of thought in the Netherlands. The Republicans in the Netherlands were not anti-religion, and they were not asking for a radical separation of church and state like the United States ended up with, or France after the Revolution. Actually, France has a much more radical separation of church and state than the United States does. But the point is that he believes that this is part and parcel of the way in which the state helps to regulate civic order. All right? And to encourage what he calls piety, meaning good behavior. And it should, for him, of course, this all has to be based on these universal religious principles, which are based on reason. All right? And therefore, it is a way to prevent corruption in religious institutions, which he critiqued, both Catholic and Protestant corruption that he saw. And again, he keeps going back to Moses and the Israelites. The last chapter is where I want to start reading again for the next half hour. Chapter 20, which begins on page 250, where he says, "Where it is shown that in a free state everyone is allowed to think what they wish and say what they wish. While the state has the right to regulate behavior, thought and expression, it does not have the right to regulate." And this is this is something that, again, he's not the only one saying this, but he is one of the most powerful exponents of what we would call free thought and free expression, and has a powerful influence on subsequent thinkers who then have, in other words, if in that article I sent you, and also from other works, John Locke was heavily influenced by Spinoza, and Locke is one of the main philosophers on which people like Jefferson based their political philosophy. So there is a direct line of descent from the founders of the American Republic to people like Locke to Spinoza. Yeah, Stephen.
How does he put together free thinking and state religion?
Because he makes a sharp distinction between thought and expression and behavior. Because the state has to regulate behavior for civic order.
So if you go into the state church, you have to do everything that everybody else is doing, but you can think what you want. Yeah,
and you can say what you want, but I don't think he would. I don't even think he would necessarily believe there should be a state church, because after all, in the Netherlands there were Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, right?
In England.
Well, I don't know about England, but his model is the Netherlands, where you have more than one church, and those people should be allowed. do what they want, but the state has the right to step in or regulate behavior if it's causing civic disorder, intolerance, and so on and so forth. And of course, again, in the Netherlands, he was part of the group that was fighting against the fundamentalist Calvinists who really wanted to bring their ideas about behavior and thought control in and using the civic government to do it. And remember, before he wrote this, his friend was put into prison for this very thing and died there.
He was for separation of church and state. I'm not clear on that.
Not the way we understand it. He was for tolerance, freedom of expression, but the state, in effect, had the right to regulate the religious institutions of the people in it.
But not to establish them.
No, not necessarily to establish them. Yes, Robert.
He appears to have had a very naive attitude about the state being benign rather than dictatorial.
Well, he recognizes that, by the way, he's against monarchies precisely for that reason. He believes in a republican democracy as being the highest form of state, since monarchies have a tendency towards corruption and overweening power. All right? So let's read a little bit what he says here. Suzanne, you want to pick it up on page 250 at the beginning. Were it easy?
Were it as easy to control people's minds as to restrain their tongues, every sovereign would rule securely and there would be no oppressive governments. For all men would live according to the minds of those who govern them, and would judge what is true or false, or good or bad, in accordance with their decree alone. But as we noted at the beginning of chapter 17, it is impossible for one person's mind to be absolutely under another's control. For no one can transfer to another person his natural right or ability to think freely and make his own judgments about any matter whatsoever, and cannot be compelled to do so. This is why a government which seeks to control people's minds is considered oppressive, and any sovereign power appears to harm its subjects and usurp their rights when it tries to tell them what they must accept as true and reject as false, and what beliefs should inspire their devotion to God. For these things are within each person's own right, which he cannot give up, even were he to wish to do so.
All right, and think about also, not only is he talking, this coming out of his own contemporary situation, but the background of the 30 Years' Wars and his own family situation of the conversos, right, with the Inquisition, trying to force conformity of thought and belief to the point of torture and oppression. So he is coming out of both his Jewish background and his background as a member of the Netherlands. This whole issue of once you begin to try and control people's thought, that's when government becomes oppressive. Now, he's specifically talking about one's religious or philosophical beliefs. Yes?
What occurs to me here, it sounds like Spinoza sees religion as basically a force for good in the society.
It can be. It doesn't necessarily.
Okay, but that's pretty much what he is saying, and as opposed to so many people that think that religion is a cause of great divisiveness in our
Well, he says that too. In other words, you have to understand, he wants to limit the role of religion in society. He wants to separate the idea of theological conformity. He wants to take theology out of philosophy. He wants to take religion out of politics. All he's saying is the state has the right to regulate the religious communities in their behavior. He sees a lot of terrible things going on in the name of religion in his society, and so he is in effect trying to break the power, the political power of religion, and turn it into something that is not what we would call necessarily conventional religion. He wants it to be, there are certain universal truths, people should be able to worship the way they want, but they should not be able to impose that on anybody else. All right? So he is certainly not seeing the role of religion in society of the people today, for example, who want to virtually eliminate the separation of church and state in the United States. He would be totally against that because he saw the corruption, he saw the violence it produced. And as we will see, subsequent to the publication of this, it happened again. All right? Okay.
It'd be against the Hobby Lobby decision.
Yeah, absolutely, it'd be against the Hobby Lobby decision. Although, you know, I don't know what he thought about corporations, but corporations existed in his day, by the way. They'd been in existence for a couple of hundred years, and the Dutch, in fact, were one of the countries that were sort of in the foremost of the evolution of corporations. But that's a whole other topic. Okay, so if you take a look at, again, he goes on this, how you cannot control a person's mind. All right, and take a look at paragraph 3. Irma, you want to pick it up there. This is on page 251.
However much, therefore, sovereign authorities are believed to have a right to all things and to be interpreters of right and piety, they will never be able to ensure that people will not use their own minds to judge about any matter whatever, and that, to that extent, they will not be affected by one passion or another. It is indeed true that they can by natural right regard as enemies everyone who does not think absolutely as they do in all things, but we have moved on from arguing about right and are now discussing what is beneficial.
In other words, the state, if in principle the state has the control, has the legal, or sort of the underlying principle of the ability to control anybody who decides to live in that, he's saying that's not necessarily good for society. Go on. So while conceding.
So while conceding that they may, by natural right, employ a high degree of violence in government.
And what he means here is coercion, right?
And arrest citizens or liquidate them for the most trivial reasons, nevertheless, everyone will agree that this is not consistent with the criteria of sound reason.
Here he's making a distinction between what the kind of laws that countries can and do set up and pure reason, which aren't co-equal. All right?
Indeed, rulers cannot do such things without great risk to their whole government, and hence we can also deny that they have absolute power to do these and similar things, and consequently that they possess any complete right to do them. For as we have proved, the right of sovereign authorities is limited by their power.
Okay, so he is very, very much against the state abusing its power. The state should be utilizing its power only through reason, because he, of course, has seen the complete opposite going on. Even, again, we should not think of the Netherlands as somehow some political utopia just because the Jews flourished there. There was a lot of struggle going on within the Netherlands over the nature of the state, the nature of religion and its ability to control people within the state. And religion and politics got all mixed up, as you will see, and constantly did. All right? So, take a look at number 6 on the next page. Irma, you want to read that?
It very clearly follows from the fundamental principles of the state, which I explained above, that its ultimate purpose is not to dominate or control people by fear or subject them to the authority of another. On the contrary, its aim is to free everyone from fear so that they may live in security as far as possible. That is, so that they may retain to the highest possible degree their natural right to live and to act without harm to themselves or to others.
This is sort of the echo of, right, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see how that echoes what he is saying here. Go on.
It is not, I contend, the purpose of the state to turn people from rational beings into beasts or automata, but rather to allow their minds and bodies to develop in their own ways in security and enjoy the free use of reason, and not to participate in conflicts based on hatred, anger, or deceit, or in malicious disputes with each other. Therefore, the true purpose of the state is, in fact, freedom.
There it is. The state is there to control people's passions, to make sure that hatred and violence do not rule. The state can even use coercive power to stop that kind of thing. But the state is there to make people's lives better, to free them from fear, and give them the highest level of freedom, especially of thought and expression.
This is sedition of the highest order.
Sedition of the highest order. Well, yeah, it was taken that way by some.
I mean, the fact is, what was surrounding him was exactly what didn't happen.
Well, you know,
He's saying this is what should be,
Yes.
but he's being sardonic.
he's calling,
He's being
to use another term, to use Lincoln's term, he's calling upon the Dutch to follow their better angels. That there are people in the Netherlands who are trying to achieve this kind of state, but there's a struggle going on. And even those who are trying to achieve something similar to his aren't necessarily willing to go as far as he is.
If I was government and I read this, I would have this man executed.
Well, he's lucky he wasn't. Yeah.
I need to get back to this thing about the religion. What he's saying, I think, is that he's saying different religion in a different way. He's saying, I think, I missed a couple of sessions, but he's saying that there are certain universal things that all major religions have in common,
Yes.
which are basically for the good of the common welfare for everybody. And he would like, so if it's used that way, and they're emphasizing the things that are positive rather than the things that are discordant in religion, that religion therefore is a very good force in society.
The way he defines it, yes, but the way he defines it is completely non-traditional.
Well, I understand.
You didn't hear the rabbi's introductory lecture. At this time, what was going on in Holland was absolutely terrible. This is a diatribe against religion of the highest and most subtle order.
No, I understand that.
All right, well, I think I get your point, but the point is, what I'm trying to say is that he's not trying to eliminate religion, but he wants the society to be, because he believes in freedom of thought and expression and freedom of worship, but he doesn't want the religious establishments involved in the governance of the state and controlling what the citizens think. So he is trying to minimize, if not eliminate, the power of the clergy and the religious institutions to utilize the secular power to enforce their ideas and their notions of behavior, because he and his friends have suffered from that.
But he wants the positive message of religion to come through.
Yeah, but again, you're overemphasizing what he's trying to do here. He's not. He is facing religious oppressives. All right, and he sees it in his own family's history. He sees it in the struggle between Protestants and Catholics in the 30 Years' War. The whole reason for the evolution of this kind of thinking and the ultimate Enlightenment ideas of the separation of church and state was the horrendous wars that religion was causing. And by the way, because of people like Spinoza and the Enlightenment, after the 17th century, wars in Europe were not about religion. There are no, contrary to what some of the radical atheists say, and I'm going to only exclude Asia from this, from the 17th to the 20th century, the vast majority of wars have nothing to do with religion. They're about nationalism and imperialism. The one exception to that, by the way, was in China in the 19th century, by the way, the Taiping revolt, which got wrapped up in religious ideas, but essentially I think it was a civil war. But in Europe, after the 17th century, the wars are not about religion anymore.
Spinoza was responsible for that.
I think the Enlightenment was responsible for that. You look at the wars of the 18th century, right? The wars between England and France, what we Canadians call the 7 Years' War. What happened after the wars after the French Revolution, where the revolutionary government started attacking neighbors that eventually evolved into the Napoleonic Wars. Those were some of the most horrendous wars in human history in terms of casualties and impact. Had nothing to do with religion. The Civil War had nothing to do with religion. The Franco-Prussian War had nothing to do with religion. The First World War had nothing to do with religion, and so on and so forth. When you look at the wars after this period, because it was agreed that religion and state should begin to separate, religion became a much lower factor in violence and in war and rationale for fighting. I mean, the Germans particularly, the German states particularly, coming out of the 30 Years' War, had to really negotiate this, because that's where the vast majority of the 30 Years' War took place in Germany, and it's estimated they lost at least 30% of their population in some areas, and in some cases 50% of the male population died in the 30 Years' War, mostly in Germany. So that was what started the whole motion. The Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, was about that there were going to be, Catholics and Protestants states, and they were going to stop fighting each other. It didn't quite work out that way completely, but that did peter out. All right.
You had a religious war in Ireland in the 20th century.
I think that's a political war. That's not a religious war. It has religious, veneer, but actually the fight between the English and the Irish, as bad as it was well, Catholics and Protestants, yes, but it really had to do, the Protestants, don't forget, were really supporters of English rule. So religion becomes a veneer.
And what about the Middle East today?
I'm not talking about the Middle East today, because that's a more complicated situation, but I'm talking about, I'm saying up to, through most of the 20th century. And by the way, the most murderous regimes were atheistic regimes, the Nazis and the communists.
Right.
Yes.
But didn't ideology substitute for religion in those
Nationalism. Nationalism.
But it's not just we're better. Here are all the reasons.
No, nationalism. It has to do with nationalism. It does not have to do with religion. Don't forget.
No, not religion, but ideology.
Yeah, okay, but that's different from saying their religion causes wars. In fact, I would even argue that throughout human history, what we consider religious wars are actually a tiny minority of the wars that have been fought. Most of them had to do with what we would call nationalism, imperialism, territorial things. But let's not get any further into that. No, it's a big diversion. I don't want to spend any more time on it, to be perfectly honest with you. Okay, so we just did paragraph 6.
Bless you.
Look at paragraph 8. Cal, do you want to pick it up there?
Here we can see how the individual may say and teach what he thinks without infringing the right and authority of the sovereign power, that is, without disturbing the stability of the state. The key is to leave decisions about any kind of action to the sovereign powers and do nothing contrary to their decision, even if this requires someone acting in a way contrary to what he himself judges best and publicly expresses. This he can do without prejudice to either justice or piety, and this is what he should do if he wants to show himself a just and good man. As we have already shown, justice depends solely upon the sovereign's decree, and thus only someone who lives according to their official decrees can be just. The highest form of piety, too, as we showed in the previous chapter, is that which is practiced with respect to the peace and tranquility of the state, and that stability could not be maintained if everyone lived according to his own judgment. Consequently, it is also impious to undertake anything on the basis of one's own judgment contrary to the decree of the sovereign whose subject one is, since were everyone allowed to do so, the ruin of the state would inevitably follow.
Again, he's not arguing for anarchy. Go on.
Furthermore, so long as one behaves according to the decrees of the sovereign authorities, one cannot act contrary to the decree and dictate of one's own reason. For it was the individual's own reason that made him decide wholly to transfer his right to live according to his own judgment to the sovereign. We can also confirm this in practice. For in any kind of council, whether it is sovereign or subordinate, it is rare for an action to be taken by a unanimous vote of all members. Nevertheless, resolutions to act are taken by the common decision of all the councillors, as much as by those who voted against, as by those who voted in favor.
Now, what he's proposing here is not what we would call representative democracy. He's not. He's in favor of what we would call a limited democracy, such as existed in the Netherlands. In other words, in the Netherlands, not everybody had the right to vote. The people who elected the councillors, the various legislative bodies of the Dutch states, came from a relatively small number of wealthy patricians and merchants relative to the total population, but it was a kind of democracy. It's actually fairly similar to what went on earlier in the Middle Ages, by the way. And the Jewish community ate that. He was not living in what we would call, you know, one vote for every person, and certainly not in terms of suffrage given to women, for example. When he says sovereign, he's not talking here really about the king. He's talking here about the sovereign body of legislators, of which there is a kind of, you know, person who acts as a kind of prime minister, and the stadtholder, which was this office, again, which was argued over as to the power of the stadtholder, was kind of the prime minister of the total country. The question ultimately came was the stadtholder going to be a hereditary monarch or not? That was one of the big fights that went on. Yeah.
It seems to me he's also arguing against majority rule in favor of consensus.
Well, he's saying consensus would be good, but sometimes that doesn't happen.
But he says the minority view should also
influence
the decision.
Absolutely. He's in favor of a form of democratic government with a form of.
I'm thinking of.
I mean, look, Greek democracy.
I'm thinking of a certain current that.
No, but Greek democracy, if, for example, it was not what we would call democracy at all. But the point is, this is part of the evolution towards the kind of democracy that evolved in the United States, which, as you know, even when the United States democracy started, was not universal democracy. It was limited. Okay, so let's skip a little further to page 255. He's talking here about what would happen if, well, in paragraph 10 he talks about disadvantages in allowing, you know, freedom. It's important that people have loyalty to the state, but if you take a look, well, actually, if you take a look back on 254, his argument is, you know, that everybody should, you know, have this freedom of expression, but how do you determine, this is the top of 254, what opinions are subversive?
Yeah.
Okay, in other words, how far do you go with freedom of expression? He says, for example, it is seditious for anyone to hold that a sovereign power does not have an autonomous right, or that one should not keep a promise, or that everyone should live according to, in other words, anarchy. In other words, you cannot oppose the concept of the state per se. Therefore, he says down, accordingly, all other opinions which do not imply such an act as such as breaking an agreement, or vengeance, or anger, are not subversive, except perhaps in a state which is corrupt in some ways, where superstitious and ambitious people who cannot tolerate free-minded person have achieved such a reputation and prominence that their authority exerts greater influence with the common people than that of the sovereign powers. Mob rule. I mean, again, in the background is his friend who got thrown in prison. It's about violence. However, we would not wish to deny that there are some views which can be published and propagated with malicious intention, though they in themselves appear to be purely concerned with truth and falsehood. So he's not saying there's absolute freedom of expression, because some can be subversive, malicious, promote violence, intolerance. He's against that.
But who measures that?
Yeah.
That's where the state does have a certain, that's where the state has the coercive power to make sure there is civic order. That's the point. The Dutch It's part of the Dutch mentality that civic order is the highest value that must be maintained. The question is, how do you maintain it without suppressing individual rights of expression? He's trying to deal with that here. And that's something, by the way, that every democratic government still tries to deal with. All right, so although there are disadvantages, like take a look at the next paragraph. Actually, that's where I want you to start. Harvey, do you want to start reading number 10?
Undeniably, there is sometimes some disadvantage in such freedom. But what was ever so cleverly designed that it entailed no disadvantages at all?
In other words, nothing's perfect.
Trying to control everything by law, or will encourage vices rather than correcting them.
In other words, if you try to control everything by law, people will inevitably break them.
Prohibition.
Prohibition, right.
Unintended consequences.
Yes, that people who, well, I think in terms of when you look at things that cause people to become inebriated in whatever way, the attempt by the state to control those things has always been a complete failure. Go on.
Things which cannot be prevented must necessarily be allowed, even though they are often harmful. How many evils arise from extravagance, from envy, greed, drunkenness, and so on? These are nevertheless tolerated because they cannot be prevented by authority of the law, even though they really are vices.
There you go. You can't stop people from getting drunk.
Or smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
How much?
No, really. I mean, that's one of the.
Smoking cigarettes.
Well, yeah, you can control certain aspects of it because again, the whole issue is how do you balance the common good with individual liberty, and how much will law, if you try to prevent something, a vice by law, that inevitably will be broken, what does that do to the whole idea of respect for law?
Yeah.
Breaks it down.
Exactly. Go on. How much more?
How much more should liberty of judgment be conceded, which is without question virtue, and cannot be suppressed? Further, the disadvantage which do arise from it can all be avoided by the authority of the magistrates.
All right, so we can stop there. So, and then he comes back to the notion of freedom of expression. In number 12, he talks about how trying to control opinions, the laws are completely useless. Take a look on the next page. Number 13. Robert, you want to pick it up there?
How much better it would be to restrain the indignation and fury of the common people than issue useless decrees which cannot be broken by those who love virtue and the arts, and render the state so narrow-minded that it cannot subsequently tolerate men with free minds. What greater ill can be devised for any commonwealth than for honest men to be banished like outlaws because they think differently from the rest and do not know how to hide this?
Like himself.
What is more dangerous, I contend, than for people to be treated as enemies and led off to death, not for misdeeds or wrongdoing, but because they make a free use of their intelligence, and for the scaffold, which should be the terror only of wrongdoers, to become a magnificent stage on which to exhibit to all a supreme exemplum of constancy and virtue, while casting the deepest reproach on the sovereign. What is exemplum?
Example.
Example.
An exemplar?
Yeah, exemplar, like an exemplar.
Those who know themselves to be honest do not fear death as wrongdoers fear it, and plead to escape punishment. Their minds are not tormented by remorse for shameful actions. On the contrary, they consider it is not a punishment, but an honor to die in a good cause. They deem it glorious to die for freedom, and what an example to give, executing men whose cause the just love, the seditious-minded detest, and of which the ignorant and feeble-minded understand nothing. Surely no one could find anything else in such an exemplum than a desire to emulate, or at least to extol it.
Okay. And this comes out of his own life experience and the experience of what was going on. I can't emphasize this enough. Take a look now at, he's actually going to get very specific here, number 15. Marianne, do you want to read that?
Examples are easily available to offer further confirmation of our thesis that no disadvantages stem from such freedom, something which cannot be suppressed simply by the authority of the sovereign, but which can in of itself readily keep men from injuring each other, even where they maintain different opinions.
Now he's going to suck up a little bit to the authorities here, okay?
I do not need to go far to find instances of this. Amsterdam is a fine example of a city which enjoys the fruits of this liberty, with its great growth being the admiration of all nations. In this flourishing republic, this superb city, people of every sect and nation live together in the greatest harmony. Before they make a loan to someone, they just want to know whether he is rich or poor, whether he is known to behave with good faith or deceitfully. For the rest, religion or sect does not come into it, because this does not help to win or lose a case before a court. And no sect is so hugely resented by others than its members, provided they harm no one, and give each man his due and live honestly, are not defended by the public authority and under the protection of the magistracy.
Okay, so, and then he talks about the controversy between what are called the monstrance and counter-remonstrance, and this again is this between the strict Calvinists who support the monarchy. In other words, those who supported a kind of constitutional monarchy in Netherlands allied themselves with the fundamentalist Calvinists, and the Republicans, allied themselves with the free thinkers. So he's talking about how this controversy is that is coming, and if you look on the next page, he refers to this early in the early part of the 17th century was when this really started, and it led to a complete split, and there's this schism therefore. Okay, so number 16. This is his summation. It's impossible to deprive men of liberty of saying what they think. That this liberty should be accorded to everyone without danger. And this is really good for the society. Number 3, that each person may possess its liberty without danger to the stability of the state. So it's good for the state. It doesn't harm the state. And that each person may possess this liberty without prejudice to piety. This will not take away from piety. It will increase piety. That issuing decrees about doctrinal issues is completely useless. The state should not get involved in deciding which religion is true, and thereby regulating behavior because of it. Finally, we have proven that not only may this liberty be granted without risk to the peace of the republic and to piety as well to the authority of the sovereign state, but also that to conserve all of such freedom must be granted. That's his point. And take a look how he ends. This completes what I propose to discuss in this treatise. It remains only to say explicitly that I have written nothing in it that I would not willingly submit to the examination and judgment of the sovereign authorities. And by this he means, as the note says, the States General of the United Province, together with the States of Holland.
Even though he didn't write it under his own name.
Yes, and the publisher was fake as well. Of my own kind. By the way, when it published, everybody knew who wrote this. It's not like it was a people didn't know. All he was really doing was trying to stop having his publisher be prosecuted for publishing this. That was his main concern. If they judge that anything I have said conflicts with the laws of the land or prejudicial to the common good, I wish it unsaid. I know that I am human, I may have erred. However, I have taken great pains not to err, and to ensure above all that I have written should be entirely consistent with the laws of the land, with piety and morality. Now, he did do some editing, by the way, and the annotations that follow are later editing, and he did want to come out with a later edition of it, but he never did. The annotations eventually did get published with it, but there's nothing significantly different. Towards the end of his life, by the way, he was in the middle of writing another treatise on politics, which he did not finish and did not get published. So I want to, if you go to the last page of what I've given you, I want to kind of finish up his life and then talk about his influence. So in 1670, this book is published. On page 3. His book is published not under his name, with a fake, there's copies of it right there, with a fake publisher. It is attacked by the strict Calvinists, including the Calvinist Council of Amsterdam, who called it a work forged in hell by a renegade Jew and the devil, and issues with the knowledge of Mayor Jan de Witt. Mein Herr. Now, I'll tell you about de Witt in a minute. He's important. But de Witt's enemies accused him of being a follower of Spinoza, which he wasn't. They never met, even though Spinoza wanted to meet him. And there's no, we don't know whether he read this book or not. Spinoza begins to correspond with Leibniz the next year. And this is the critical point. In 1672, Louis XIV of France invades the Netherlands. This is considered in Dutch history one of the worst years of the Dutch Republic. They have to open Louis XIV invades with an army of 170,000 men. And they have a new rifle technology, the flintlock. And they defeat the Dutch, and the Dutch, in desperation, open the dikes to flood the land to stop the French army, which it does. But because of that, they actually lose a piece of property to the French. So the people who were in charge of Holland at this time were the Republicans. They were led by this man, Jan de Witt. Here is a picture of him. He lived between 1625 and 1672. Once the war was over, now de Witt was one of Holland's greatest politicians. He is considered in Holland to be one of their greatest politicians. He was a Republican. He tried to eliminate the office of the stadtholder. He was the prime minister. He tried to eliminate the office of the stadtholder. He did not want to have a hereditary monarchy, but he was willing to compromise to allow one of William III of Orange, who was an infant at the time he became the stadtholder, that he could be the stadtholder, but then after he tried to eliminate the office, but he was willing to compromise politically not to. So he was sort of in charge when this terrible defeat happened. And his enemies used this as a means of attacking him. And one of the things that they attacked him for was they thought the religious began, because politics and religion are all wrapped up here. So the monarchists and the strict Calvinists are in alliance, and the freethinkers and the Republicans are in alliance. Because it's a natural alliance. They're often the same people. So what happens is, and this is horrible, is that on August the 20th, de Witt is assassinated. And de Witt came from a patrician family in Holland. And he got in politics very young, and he was very influential and extremely skilled. He was also trying to keep Holland, balanced between the powers of France and the German states and England. In other words, he did all this diplomatic juggling to try and keep Holland together and protected. But they blamed him for this defeat. So he was assassinated by a carefully organized lynch mob. He was visiting his brother Cornelius de Witt, who was in prison at the time, and a mob gathered. He was shot in the neck, and then his brother was killed, and they took and hung their naked bodies upside down, and virtually the bodies were dismembered.
That's what they did with Mussolini. They hung him upside down.
Yeah, well, what happened was that the authorities at the time kind of stood by and did nothing. So this was a horrible, horrible thing. All of the people who were sort of in de Witt's parties were terrified by this. And it caused a lot of, the monarchists kind of came into the ascendancy with de Witt gone. And by the way, here is a statue to De Witt and his brother that was put up at the beginning of, in the early part of the 20th century. He is now venerated as the father of the Dutch Republic.
Just for clarity,
No, it's not in Amsterdam. It's in their home city of Dordrecht.
Can you tilt? Yeah, that's better.
For clarity, the mob was organized by the monarchists.
The monarchists, Calvin. Yeah, exactly. They blamed him for the defeat, and they used this as an excuse not only to murder him and his brother, but also, in effect, to take over. And what happened was that things for the Republicans and the freethinkers got very dangerous. And even amongst the moderate philosophers, there was a real attempt to step back. So even some of the people that should have been supporting Spinoza's position started to attack Spinoza, backed off from it. In the Dutch universities, this was a fight between amongst those who were Cartesians, followers of René Descartes, because all of a sudden the Cartesian philosophy was called into question because of this same fight. And so people who previously had been strong Cartesians started to back off because they were afraid for their lives. In 1673, Spinoza was offered the professorship of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg, which would have been good for him to get the heck out of Holland at the time, right? But he turned it down. I want to read you his first of all, who is Karl Ludwig, who was the Elector of Palatine, was one of the more important German princes, and he had turned the University of Heidelberg into a center of liberal philosophy, and he had one of his, the main people at the university, a guy named Johann Ludwig Fabricius, who really didn't like Spinoza's work, to invite him to come to be a professor. This is like highly unusual, by the way, because of his Jewish origin. And Spinoza thought about it, and he graciously declines. This is what he says. If I had ever had any desire to undertake a professorship in any faculty, I could have wished for none other than that which was offered to me through you by His Serene Highness the Elector Palatine, especially on account of the freedom to philosophize that this most gracious prince is pleased to grant, not to mention my long-felt wish to live under the rule of a prince whose wisdom is universally admired. But since I have never intended to engage in public teaching, I cannot induce myself to embrace this excellent opportunity, although I have given long consideration to the matter. And in effect, he's afraid, first of all, that he wouldn't have time to write, but secondly, that it would inevitably lead to some kind of control on what he says and what he publishes.
This is what you interpret?
No, this is what he says in the rest of the letter. He does it very politely. So he turns it down. And
was he afraid physically?
No, he wasn't afraid physically. He just felt that he didn't want to depend on anybody. That's why he made his own living. He wanted to depend on no institution or person to prevent him from, first of all, doing his philosophy and saying what he thought. And inevitably being part of any kind of faculty, there was the possibility that they would come to him and say, you can't say that, you can't teach that, you can't publish that. No matter how liberal that...
But you can always resign if that happens.
Yeah, but moving to Heidelberg is a big deal to come all the way from Holland. He just, he wasn't living a solitary life. He had a lot of friends, he traveled, whatever, but he controlled his own life. That's what he wanted. And he made his own money. He didn't have to depend on anybody. So in 1674, to show you how things got with the Treatise, it was effect the states of Holland banned it as a book. And there was even attempts to round up copies of it and to destroy them, but it was too late. It had spread too far by that point. In that year, the Netherlands and England signed the Peace of Westminster, where New York City became New York. New Amsterdam became New York. And in November, they ceded the entire territory of the New Netherlands, which is now New York State, to the English. I mean, the Dutch power was really receding at this point, and England was really ascending in power. And of course, but the biggest threat to Holland was really France under Louis XIV. In 1675, Spinoza completes the Ethics. He starts preparing it for publication, but he backs off because of everything going on. Leibniz then actually visits Spinoza in The Hague. And the Jews of Amsterdam complete the building of the Synagogue, the largest synagogue in Europe. In Rebecca Goldstein's book on Spinoza, she sort of creates a scene because Spinoza was in Amsterdam around that time visiting. He could have been there for the dedication of the synagogue. So she sort of invents a scene of him standing back from the crowd watching the dedication of the synagogue, including seeing some of his relatives, and not identifying himself, staying back. It's a rather lovely little conceit that she does, because he could have been there.
What does it mean? Do you know? Esnoga?
Well,
version of synagogue.
yeah, probably. But it also, noga in Aramaic has a connotation of light, by the way. I'm not sure. In that same year, Prince William III is installed as the governor, and I'm not going to pretend to pronounce it. And this is the beginning of putting him forward as the stadtholder and somebody close to a monarch. Now, in 1677, he dies. And he dies fairly young, partly from probably inherited weak lungs from his mother, who also died of lung disease, but also probably from the effects of his grinding lenses and inhaling glass fragments. In other words, his health began to seriously decline. But nobody expected him to die when he did. He rented the first floor of this house of some people in The Hague who he became quite friendly with, and it was remarkable because the house, they had a lot of kids, so it must have been a noisy house. And they would go to church, and they'd come back, and he would sort of ask them about the sermon. Occasionally, he attended at churches just to see the sermon, but he never became a Christian. His friend Oldenburg in England, who, because of the wars between England and Holland, had not been as in touch, became more conventionally Christian and was kind of assuming that Spinoza would end up as a kind of Christian, but he never did. And apparently he was quite sick, and one day they went to church, and they had called the doctor, and the doctor had come, and essentially they came back and he was dead. What happened was that his friends immediately gathered, took his desk, which was filled with all his manuscripts and letters, and sent it to his publisher in Amsterdam immediately. His family, he had a surviving sister, at first was going to try and sue to be one of the recipients of his estate. But he didn't have very much, and he had more debts than he had property. So his family made a legal declaration that they don't want to have anything to do with his estate. But when they thought he might have something, they still wanted to claim a family connection. Anyway, his friends auctioned off all of his possessions to pay off all of his debts, which included to the people he was renting his house from his barber and various other people. There were a few, it didn't pay for everything, so some of his friends paid off the rest of it. And then he had a funeral where a whole bunch of his friends took him, and they buried him in, this is, by the way, his house in The Hague, which is still there. They reconstructed the inside of his house. So this is his library. Here is his workroom. This is also one of the rooms there. In other words, he had his workroom, his library, his sort of, area where he lived. And they took him in a funeral procession of about 5 or 6 coaches, and they buried. Here is a statue that has been put up outside the house where he lived in The Hague.
It never fails to amaze me, especially when we have a blackout.
Yeah.
You know how cold and dark it is, and yet how productive people like that were in those days when it was cold and dark.
Yeah.
And they only had candlelight. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, after his death, I'm going to get back to this later. His friends, he was buried in this cemetery. The cemetery, for any of you who took it today, he is in the New Church Cemetery in The Hague. This is the original stone here. It says in Latin, "The earth here covers the bones of Benedict de Spinoza, long interred in the New Church." In the summer of 1956, 279 years later, his admirers erected a basalt tombstone behind here with his portrait of him and the Hebrew word Amcha, your people. The Jewish community of Amsterdam was represented by George Hertz Shikmoni, a sign that Spinoza was once again recognized as a member of the community. Now, if you go back to the timeline, after his death, his friends publish his...
Consecrated church, Rabbi?
Yeah, it was a liberal Protestant churchyard. After his death, his friends publish his all of his books in this work called the Opera Posthuma, which includes the first publication of the Ethics. In 1678, a Dutch translation is made. This is highly significant. In 1688, William III landed in southern England. This is the Glorious Revolution, and this is where he becomes, the King of England at that point. Louis XIV in that year also declares war again on the Netherlands. And what happens the next year is that now William III, as King of England, joins the League of Augsburg in the Netherlands. This grand alliance was formed to counter the war of aggression launched by Louis XIV against the Palatinate states in Germany. And at this time, the Theological-Political Treatise is published in England, but without his name on the title page. By the way, Louis XIV inflicted a terrible defeat upon the Grand Alliance, his armies, and so the next year there was a treaty. His influence. So if you take a look on the last page, in the 17th century, Leibniz was influenced them, although Leibniz at one point publicly attacked the treatise because, again, for probably political reasons, it was kind of nasty of him to do so. But Leibniz was certainly influenced by the work of Spinoza. John Locke, definitely. John Locke spent some time in the Netherlands and was friends in the same circles of people who were friends of Spinoza, and he read the treatise. David Nieto, a very interesting. He was the Chacham, the chief rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in London in the late 17th, early 18th century. And Nieto was somebody who was he was a Copernican, and he was he got in a lot of trouble for of giving us a sermon accepting the Copernican theory. And he had a lot of trouble with the lay authorities of the synagogue, but he read Spinoza, and there's no doubt about that Spinoza's thought, especially the ethics, had an impact on Nieto's own theology. In the 18th century, you see a whole bunch of, this is not a complete list, by the way, a guy named Novalis, which was a pseudonym of a German poet, Lessing, Mendelssohn, and we'll see about Mendelssohn in a minute, Goethe, Hegel, and one of the early Maskilim, one of the early Jewish Enlightenment figures, Solomon Maimon, who was a friend of Mendelssohn's. He was an Eastern European Jew, completely sort of went over the edge into secularism.
This is Moses Mendelssohn we're talking about.
Yes, Moses Mendelssohn, yes. In the 19th century, you see the influences of Spinoza on Kant, Nietzsche, Marx. A lot of the Jewish Maskilim are now reading Spinoza. Adolf Frank, Moses Hess, I forgot to put in Heinrich Heine. He's one of the people influenced by him. Coleridge, Shelley, George Eliot, did a translation of some of Spinoza's works. And in the 20th century, Freud, Einstein, Ben-Gurion, Spinoza's impact on certain streams of Zionist thought is quite considerable because of the Maskilim reading this, and so it was his work became part of Jewish secular culture. And here's where I want to show you something really interesting. This is the title page of the translation of the Ethics into Hebrew by a guy by the name of Solomon Rubin, who lived between 1823 and 1910. He published it in Vienna in 1885. Here is the title page in German, and here it is in Hebrew. I wish the cantor were here. He translates the ethics as Cheker Eloha, which doesn't mean the ethics. Im Torat Adam. In other words, he's translating it as a kind of divine, it sort of translates as kind of divine investigation. So now you're getting Zionists and Hebrew readers reading Spinoza in Hebrew, and as a result, people like Hillel Zeitlin, who was in the early 20th century, was a late 19th, early 20th century, was an extremely important thinker and poet. He was killed in the Holocaust. Isaac Bashevis Singer writes a novel about Spinoza. Santayana was influenced by Spinoza, Wittgenstein, and, for those interested in the environment, Arne Naess, who's a Scandinavian who was the founder of deep ecology. His whole philosophy is based upon Spinoza. And I could have made this list 3 times as large. These are just some of the more prominent ones. Okay? Now, I want you to go back to page 1. I don't think I've got anything else. By the way, just to show you, here is the first lines of a poem by Einstein called On Spinoza's Ethics, which reads, "How much do I love that noble man, more than I could say with words. I fear, though, he'll remain alone with a holy halo of his own." This is in German, and this is just the translation in English of the first lines. And here, and you'll see this when I send it to you, here's a bunch of quotes of Einstein on Spinoza. And Einstein was heavily influenced by Spinoza's perspective on the world and his notion of what we would call religion. But I want to conclude with looking at something that Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who is the rabbi of the conservative synagogue in White Plains and a theologian and teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary and former dean of the Rabbinical School, wrote. He is talking about the importance of theology in modern Judaism, specifically conservative Judaism, and he is attacking the idea that Judaism is without theology, and he traces this to Spinoza. Somebody like to read this? 350. I hope you can sit to read this. This is very interesting. We won't read all of it, but you should really read it. Somebody want to begin?
350 years ago, a Jewish thinker was anathematized and put in Hiram by the Jewish community of Amsterdam, whose members were scandalized by his views. As some of you know, I have taught his philosophy for some years at JTS, as recently as this past semester. Obviously, I would not do so were I not to have a fair amount of regard for Spinoza's thought and the ways in which it continues to challenge us today. But there is one idea with which he is forever associated, which made his break with the Jewish community inevitable, and that was the idea, fully expressed in his Theological-Political treatise, that Judaism was a system of law and not a religion, not a conveyor of timeless religious truths. For Spinoza, of course, it meant that with the end of all Jewish sovereignty and self-government 17 centuries before him, Jewish law had lost the context that gave it any meaning at all, and that the rabbis had been irrational, not only in retaining it, but in developing and refining it in the way they had. The formulation, however, was stark and shocking, engaging with Jewish law on the one hand, and engaging with religious thought, or in short with religion, on the other were not at all the same thing.
And then he goes on to say that Heschel said, he quotes Heschel from his book Torah Min Shamayim, it was Spinoza who injected into Jewish thought the idea that Judaism is not a religion but a legal system, and this doctrine has been coursing through the body of modern Jewish thought like venom. And so what he says is that Mendelssohn accepted this characterization of Judaism, but put the law aspect of it in positive terms, not negative, like Spinoza, right? That Judaism was a system of laws. And here Tucker quotes Alexander Altman. In interpreting the Sinaitic revelation as having commandments rather than eternal truths for its content, Mendelssohn was obviously following Spinoza's precedent, but he was far from adopting the corollaries of this theory as found in the Tractatus. Thus, Mendelssohn refused to accept Spinoza's thesis that the purpose of the Mosaic legislation was purely temporal and political. Yet in limiting revelation to the legislative aspect, he shared Spinoza's point of view. Now, what he says in the next paragraph, Tucker says in the next paragraph, this was picked up by Reform Judaism, which is one of the reasons, which was the sort of philosophical underpinning of how Reform Judaism did away with most of Jewish law by claiming there was nothing spiritual in it. In fact, they accepted this Spinozian characterization of Judaism. All right? And then he says there's a surprising mirror image to this. It was not only picked up by the Reform movement, it was picked up by Orthodox authorities, a guy named Yechezkel Landau, who defined, the idea that what we would call the theological underpinnings of Judaism, which are here Midrash and Agadah, are maybe essentials of religion, but have no impact on halachic decision-making. So look at Tucker's paragraph here, and I haven't given you his whole essay, which is quite interesting. Here was another version of Spinoza's venom, now paradoxically inverted into what was predominated as normative Jewish legal thought in the modern era. Religious law and religion are in this view indeed separate. But unlike Spinoza's and Mendelssohn's take on it, this version held that the religious law really did embody of all God's will for living our lives, always and everywhere, as opposed to how we may think or speculate of this. And he ends with an interesting question in this particular paragraph, because Spinoza possibly was seeing these odd offspring of the break he initiated between religious law and religion. And so what Cohen is claiming, and he wrote this, by the way, in the time of the controversy in the conservative movement over whether to accept gays and lesbians as equal in rabbinical school and marriages and all this kind of stuff, where the opponents of it were, in effect, taking what he calls this legal positivist perspective on Judaism, that what the law says is normative. And Tucker was challenging that perspective, not just here, but in his ultimate response on this, saying, what are we? We're not Orthodox Jews, and Judaism is not only about law, it's also about its underlying spirit and theology. So in effect, he's trying to say, agreeing with Heschel, who Tucker is one of the experts on, we have to reject this venom that Spinoza started and say that Judaism isn't all just about halakha. Because even today, you'll see Judaism, there's no such thing as theology in Judaism. Judaism is not a theological, it's more about how you behave rather than what you believe. And that's Spinoza. And Tucker and others, and I'm certainly a follower of this, says that's wrong. We have to get rid of this and go back to this notion that theological understanding underlies everything that we do, and that we should not be separating theology and behavior the way Spinoza did.
When you use the word venom,
yeah,
you kind of lay your cards on the table.
It's Heschel's words.
Right.
It's Heschel's words. It's Heschel's
but
words.
It explains where he's coming from.
Right.
Rather than this is a rational man being logical, this is venom.
No, I mean, I would say that Spinoza's attack on Judaism was highly unfair, and his claim that, there's nothing spiritual in the Bible is completely wrong. But he had his own reasons for doing that, obviously. But it had a long-lasting history, both outside of Judaism, but even within Judaism. Okay, we're going to stop there. Obviously, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's have the recording back. We can stop it. I will, if you've got, let me just hang on a second.